Recording in progress. There's Alex. Welcome. All right, I'm going to say we have a 2/3 majority. All right. So where we last left off was sort of covering this larger sort of part three, the section called skills. Now, since we last met, I kind of had I woke up from a dream and I'm like, hey, maybe I should break out a bunch of the, in addition to sort of skills and principles, we should also talk about traits. And I don't know if I'm going to stick with this refactoring. I do kind of like to have it broken down into three things, but some of these, are things that I could just lift wholesale from the other two sections or that I could emphasize or whatever. And I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail, but these are the traits that I've identified as being important in a leadership role. Not necessarily in this order, but the fact that they came to me in this order is probably significant. So I'm just gonna where the doc is, you can go back and skim this later. So that's why part two became part three. We were going over this massive list of all the things that are different from being an IC by and large. And we had just finished talking about one-on-ones. Not that you don't do one-on-ones as an IC, it's a very different role being on the other side of the chair. All right, so chapter 21, of course, I reference a chapter number that may very well change in the future, but the topic is organizing projects. Now, project management, program management, depending on the company, may be a sort of set of roles and responsibilities that is dedicated to a product management group. And some companies are super heavy-handed with their product and program management teams to where everything regarding a schedule is in the hands of people that aren't line managers by and large. PacBio, for instance, was very heavy-handed on this. Some companies basically have sort of one person who is the sort of philosophical director of how project management is done, and they do some high-level program management, but a lot of it is sort of devolved to the individual teams. And in particular, when you're doing Scrum, you might have the Scrum Master doing that stuff and whatever. And usually you can figure out your priorities based on what's coming from product or whatever. But Lacuna, we have someone who's a manager in each of the vertical teams, and we don't have more than one Nancy. We only have the one Nancy who's in charge of helping people with doing Scrum in the way that best suits the team and is the best interface with the company and so on and so forth. So the line managers at Lacuna do a fair amount of sort of project management. And not always. Sometimes ICs are put in the role of Scrum Master or whatever. George has done an awful lot of sort of project management stuff, but it's definitely a thing that you'll be exposed to. So the biggest part in my mind of organizing projects is just making sure that you understand the priorities, right? So because when you don't have priorities, it's just chaos, right? Especially when there's any sort of sensible order of operations. And even in a Scrum model where you're not fully waterfalling things out, there are clearly things that you have to do first, second, and third, even if it's just time box exercises of feasibility and what have you. And so there's sort of the internal priorities of the team, and then there's sort of the external priorities of the company. So there's the micro priorities, and then there's the macro priorities. A macro priority might be, from Hugh saying, well, we need to ship, the following, we need to ship at least 5 features this quarter, right? Or whatever it is, or we need to hit a revenue goal or something like that. And external priorities also sort of includes what customer priorities are. And that's often mediated by product, but not always. And of course, there's things that you do that aren't directly related to product, right? Especially on the platform team, things performance tuning and whatever, things that don't show up where there's a button to click for a customer or what have you. Things okay, well, we've got a ticket that got filed by our security audit, right? How do you prioritize that, for example? And so now you're in the position of adjudicating well, there are things, here's another 2x2 for you. There's things that are urgent or not, and there's things that are important or not. And there really can be things that are, sort of urgent, that feel urgent, but that aren't actually important. Like, oh my God, there's this demo that we need to do that in the end is not going to matter or whatever. And the problem with things that, like, if you drive yourself by urgency alone, which it's easy to do, you can drop things that don't feel important. And so if you look at something like, security audit, you might say like, well, we have 6 months before we lose our SOC 2 or whatever. If it's 6 months out, is it urgent? Well, no, but you got to make time for that. And so like there's this set of balancing acts that you have to go through that involves, when you're in a leadership position, involves sort of an integrating all of these different possible ways of deciding what comes first, second, and third, justifying that to whomever might come and poke you on it, whether it's somebody in product or your chain of command, or even you're at a meeting and the CEO is like, why aren't you working on this or whatever? You have to have a rationale. You say, I'm happy to work on that. That's the third thing on my list. The first thing is this, completely important thing, and this other urgent thing, and then whatever. So just like be thoughtful about integrating all these inputs and coming up with priorities. And then you have to sort of make sure that the people on the team understand what the priorities are. And you don't have to, if you've got a list of 10 things in order, you don't have to like lay out every single thing. In fact, most of the time, I like to make sure that people have, knowledge of, 2 or 3 things, because stuff can change. You don't want people to get too attached to what's different between position 8 and position 10 in the list. It probably don't matter. Don't clutter up people's headspace with that. But also, like, if there's 5 things on the priority list, right? Like, that context switching is often just brutal for productivity. If you're just jumping around from thing to thing to thing, and your name's not Neil, it can be really debilitating in terms of, having to unload one set of things and load another set of things into your brain, whatever. And that brings me to, there's no such thing as same priority, right? You can't say, well, these are the 2 most important things. If you don't have a 1, 2, 3, and so on ordering, then like nothing has priority, right? And you have to be aware not just of what like the person in question you're giving priorities to, is working on or whatever. You need to know, sometimes, again, in Agile, you try to have things loosely coupled. And it's like, okay, we're going to get a bunch of stuff done or whatever. But there are points of like integration and shipping where, especially where like if a front end person and a back end person are working on a component together, or a specific feature that's going to run end to end. And, you go and yank the back end person, and the front end person is like, well, I can't really do anything without that API. Now, by being sloppy and not sufficiently attentive to priorities, you've, made somebody else, maybe not useless, but like you've potentially really affected their productivity. And you can say, oh, well, they can always go work on something else. Like, well, but if they were working on that thing, it was probably relatively important for some reason, or urgent, or both, to work on that thing. And so that can lead into this sort of cascade where if like somebody is working on, project A and it's causing project B to languish, then whoever's assigned to project B, whoever's going to deliver project B, whoever's career is riding on project B or whatever, like you're harming them, right? So you can't always satisfy everybody all the time, but that's why you should be sort of like keeping tabs on as much as possible. And, hopefully things are well insulated inside the vertical teams. And that's one of the reasons we do vertical teams, is we put sort of nutritionally complete groups of people together and say, okay, you're working on this thing and you're not working on other things. And again, like we break that model sometimes. Sometimes we have, teams of one. Again, Neil loves to freelance, and, good for Neil. That's awesome. But if everybody was operating that way, like it just wouldn't work very well. And, Neil has also spent time in V teams where he's just like, part of the V team. I'm not picking on Neil in any way, by the way. And I'm also not like glorifying Neil. I'm just saying that like circumstances have been such that Neil's had some opportunities to jump around more that aren't, completely in, whatever the model is. And I think that flexibility is important. I've been at companies where the V team model, for some people, it feels like, a wonderful sort of comforting structure. And for some, it feels like a straitjacket. And, you can be really rigorous about your team structure, or you can be, pretty adaptive, right? And again, we're sort of bleeding between the topic here between, project organization and team structure and so on and forth. But, all these things are interconnected, right? Like none of these things is happening sort of in isolation, and can be, it's not like math or physics or something, right? It's more like systems theory stuff. Another sort of related note is, if you giving somebody, two high priority things at the same time and not really doing a good job of adjudicating which thing is more important, sometimes that's like a weasel manager trick to like, oh, well, I'm just going to push this person as hard as I can. And whether or not it is sort of best in some other ways in terms of like their, well-being or able to get stuff done. If it's just they look really busy, which means that my bosses think that I'm, doing a good job of extracting, value from salaried employees, that there can be sort of like, managers can do sort of selfish, self-centered, output extraction, output maximization in ways that I think are short-sighted. So I try to be really careful about making sure that like if people have, a 2-week sprint to accomplish some things, you don't put 50% more in there just to see if you can get it, right? Like that's just not cool. Again, you need to be able to explain your rationale. I've mentioned that sort of briefly earlier, that like, anybody at any time that says, what are the priorities? And you can tell them, if they want to know why, you should have a reason why, other than so-and-so told me to, or whatever. I mean, sometimes you get handed a priority list and you don't have any say in the matter, but more often than not, chains of command that like actually do delegate authority and decision-making, down to the, the nodes closest to the individual contributors, will give you some agency and let you make decisions or whatever, but you better be able to articulate them. Another interesting concept is when you're directing people and projects or whatever, how much leeway and latitude and agency do you give them? It's sort of, there's this concept of willful compliance, right? Where you can absolutely destroy a system by doing exactly what you're told, right? So if you follow the letter of the law but not the spirit, like basically, little to nothing can happen. Sometimes it can be actively counterproductive. So, this spirit of like empowering people to get their jobs done is sort of antithetical to the, really like going into too much detail and structure about exactly how a project is to be done. Like it's better to set sort of medium to high level goals and then let the ICs, work out, the nitty gritty details. And sometimes that tendency to want to sort of, over flex, your musculature, because, anybody from here that goes into management was probably a really good IC, going into it. And sometimes you want to like, oh, I can still do this stuff, or I know a lot about this. And, sometimes you might be tempted to, tell people how it is. And, if you really have maintained deep expertise, sure, but just be careful about being too prescriptive, right? So you want to like empower people to feel like they have some autonomy, some authority to, make the fine grained decisions that, like make engineering satisfying. Right? That might sort of, I have an example of this. There's this thing where a dad, plays this game with their kid where they're like, okay, tell me how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And then the dad like rigorously follows the instructions to the letter, like pretending like he's never made a PBJ in his life. And it's hilarious. And I think it's a really useful, I should put a link in here. Also I have a cat in my lap. So again, projects require, sort of enough structure to get it done, but not so much structure that it feels brittle. Okay, so when you are trying to assess priorities, right? Well, how do you know? I mean, you just like hang out in meetings or whatever? Well, you're out collecting the inputs, right? Is one of your jobs in a leadership role. So like, internalizing like how the business works, there's a much higher threshold for like sort of understanding the business model, and that increases at each level of management. Like as a line manager, you should know, a fair amount about the business. Directors, like, you really need to deeply internalize the business, and VPs, have to be absolutely, like, that one of their first and foremost jobs is to match what the engineering team is doing and how and why and with whom, at a really not like super complex level, but a complex enough level that, like, it's hard to get to VP because there's very few people that they trust to be that interface between the business, which includes sales, marketing, products, accounting, all that stuff, HR, being the impedance match between that and the engineering organization that they're running. So again, you don't have to be like awesome or amazing at it, but you should know. Obviously pay really close attention to product. Product is the team that's tasked with sort of best understanding the customer, collecting the inputs from, the sales team, and describing, to the best of their ability, what should be built to create value for the customer. And, I've seen people like butt heads with product or think they can do it better or whatever. And like, I get that impulse, but I think broadly people should be kind of aware of what their sort of primary responsibilities are and what they're going to be graded on, at review time. And that's not to say, like, if you think product is doing something overtly stupid, you just roll over and do it, right? Like, you can have opinions. You can say, oh, I think I know how to, may I offer some suggestions or what have you. But by and large, having sort of a respectful dialogue instead of like, oh, I can't believe this product people they don't have no idea what they're doing or whatever. Like, you have to be really careful with that sort of approach, to just letting people, do their jobs. And again, I'm not like saying don't have any opinions. I'm just saying, like, be really thoughtful about, if it's not ultimately your responsibility or your boss's responsibility or your organization's responsibility for doing the thing, give people the benefit of the doubt, right? If they turn out that they're not great at it, that's going to be somebody else's problem. Don't try to be a hero. And always, of course, listen really carefully to your boss. Again, if you're a line manager, you probably have a senior manager or a director who's got, sort of one or two levels up in the game of understanding, like, what the real priorities are and, how much do you want to put into new features versus performance versus security versus, tech debt versus whatever, right? Like, all these things that need to get prioritized. And there are places where, you'll have to push in all likelihood for, say, like, product is never going to say, hey, can you clean up that tech debt? Right. Oh, hey, can you make it, slightly more performant or whatever, unless things are really dire. So, like, you have to advocate for the product in a way that's appropriate, and on behalf of your team. And another thing about, listen to your boss and asking is, like, you better hope that you only have one boss. If you have more than one boss, that's just a ridiculous, organization. And if you ever feel that way, that, like, if somebody's like, oh, no, I need this to be a higher priority. If somebody from product and says, I need you to prioritize this work. If someone from, customer success comes to you and says, I need you to prioritize that, you don't report to them. Full stop. And if somebody tries to override your priorities, you contact your boss as soon as possible and say, hey, somebody's trying to do this. And I'm like, in cases that, for me, I'm like, okay, I'll go talk to him, because there might be something that changed. There might be an emergency or whatever. But ultimately, if you're getting pulled in a bunch of different directions by different people, right? Like, somebody has to be the decider, right? Because otherwise you can just, like, context switch into, zero productivity. Of course, listen to your team too. Oh, shoot. If they're grousing about how, like, oh, product is really asking for stupid things, or, we had to shortcut this to meet a deadline or whatever, like, make sure tech debt tickets get filed. Make sure that, the overall productivity of your team doesn't sort of degrade over time by accumulated tech debt or, poorly designed features or whatever. And again, like, if there are conflicting priorities, you need to do the same thing that you would do as an IC would, which is if you're being told different things by different people, ultimately your boss should be the decider. So for me, if I had any question about what I should be doing, and I'm often doing a bunch of things, and some of them are like apples to oranges comparisons that you can't really prioritize. But I rarely feel directly conflicted about like, oh, I really don't know which I should prioritize. But if I did, I'd go away. You know, and ultimately, if someone, you know, make sure that the people that report to you understand that you are the one that sets the priorities, that, you know, their manager is the one, and they don't get, you know, they don't get to be pushed around by, you know, other teams and other groups without like very explicit sort of cooperation or authorization from their boss. Okay, that was a 20-minute rant on priorities. Gonna pause for questions and comments. Okay, cool. Feels like I covered it, you know, with enough coats of paint that we can continue. And again, we can also stop at the end of this and have a little, you know, going back and touching on things as necessary. So when you're doing project management, you're not just managing the priorities, you're managing people, of course, which ultimately that's what you do. You're a people manager. But I wanted to start with the priorities because oftentimes I think that's what needs to be pushed into the foreground. But certainly people management means if you have a bunch of work to do, right? And some of that work is suitable for, say, front-end people, and some of it's for back-end people, or some of it's for analytics people, or some of it's for, you know, some of it's DevOps related or whatever. You know, you need to make sure that you're not asking someone, say, that's like literally never written in a mobile app in their life. You're like, oh, well, you're a front-end person, I'm just going to, you know, plug you in. Or if it's really complicated work, that you know, you might be reluctant to hand it to the, you know, the kid that's fresh out of college or whatever, that, you know, like it's his or her first job or whatever. And so, you know, you have the team you have. You can always ask for other resources or whatever, but like by and large, you know, there's a something of an art to like matching all the things that need to be done, and a lot of that's going to happen on the Scrum teams. And you know, there's a fair amount of self-organization that happens. Like people kind of have the general sense, you know, I would encourage you know, junior people to say no to work that feels really daunting, or to pair up with somebody senior. That's a really great learning opportunity, and people often appreciate that. You also want to be mindful of taking people who are like super skilled and, you know, making them do something really crappy. Like poor Carter at Lawa had to work on that, you know, Microsoft Power BI stuff for them. And like he'd never worked on it, whatever. And this was an example of like, I just hated to do it and I didn't feel like I had a choice. And as soon as, you know, we were able to get him out of there, I started giving him, you know, sort of more interesting, challenging, you know, projects. And that's one of the reasons he's on the UPS team. Not just that he's, you know, a great employee and what have you, but there's a little bit of a reward factor there for like, thank you for slogging in the Lawa Power BI salt mines for however long that was. And, you know, you should get that. That should be acknowledged and what have you. And then, you know, another part of this is keeping people on their growth curves. Like we've talked a little bit about the growth curve of like, you know, how quickly are you learning a subject and mastering it, and sort of like how great are you going to be when you're like as good as you're ever going to be, right? You know, going back to, you know, I felt maybe 15 years into my career as an IC, I just wasn't getting any better, right? That like I was running in place to stay still, and that's one of the reasons I switched on to a different growth curve, because I really like being on that. You know, but one of your jobs is to make sure that people are on, you know, the growth curve that they want, right? Some people just aren't that ambitious, and that's okay too, right? Like if they're, you know, they're kind of are who they are and where they are, and they're like, you know, I'm good. I mean, for me in a leadership role, like the only place for me as senior director go is VPE, and I don't want it. You know, I was very blunt with Wei that, you know, I am not, you know, ambitious in any particular way, that I actually don't want a VPE role. Or at least, you know, today I don't. 6 months ago I didn't. So, you know, Wei's not like really pushing me hard on anything in particular. But if I had ambitions, I would be like, you know, like constantly asking Wei, hey, what do I have to do to get to the next level or whatever? And that would be Wei's job to be thinking about that. And, you know, because she knows the gig better than I do. So she would be feeding me. It's your job to be like, okay, I see that so-and-so has been doing the same thing for a while and they're good at it, but like to make them a more complete engineer, they need more like challenging work or more, you know, design related work instead of just like banging out features, you know, whatever it is. So you can't always be like, moving people on their growth curves. And sometimes they just have to go off and like do a little side work here and there, or just, reading, that's not necessarily project related or whatever to keep growing, or going to conferences, or, making time to, read books on the subjects that they're interested in, things like that. So you got to balance the sort of the needs of the business and the needs of the individual, because you're trying to like see how many different ways you can get people paid, but also by expanding the skill set of your org, you have more flexibility, right? So if you have someone that comes in as a front-end engineer, and, instead of wanting to be like, the very best front-end engineer ever, they're like, well, I feel like I'd be more well-rounded if I also learned some backend and some DB and some DevOps or whatever. So you're constantly looking to feed them things, or Jane's been doing some front-end work, hadn't done a lot of it prior to Lacuna, for example. And I think that's awesome. Again, it builds that sort of team flexibility. And again, some people are on more sort of generalist paths, and some people are on like really specialized paths. Like so far, Irene is on a very specialist path, for example. But I have no doubt that if like she wanted to learn anything in particular, she could be branching out. She could be hanging out and writing React code. She could be doing database optimization. She's just, she's just really capable and smart. But I've got a mental model. She reported to me for a while. I've got a mental model of where she's at and where she wants to go, and so on and so forth. And as work comes in, I'm, sort of air traffic controlling that to people as best I can. And that touches on, you want to know how people want to get paid beyond the salary and maybe some equity or whatever, right? Like there's the that sort of growth as an engineer, as a professional, or even like completely switching, from one type of role to another, right? There's work satisfaction can come from a lot of different sources. It can be knowing that your project or product is doing some good in the world. It can be just working with really interesting people. It can be stretching yourself, or it can be just, relatively simple jobs that are really well done. And you should figure that out. Going back to the, one-on-ones, like that's a thing you should be, sort of keeping tabs on. And it's not static. It's not like people are unchanging. So like, you should be checking in, how are you with this thing you're working on now? Do you find it challenging? You had a hypothesis that it would be fun to work on React. Jane, are you still finding that to be the case? I don't want to like pigeonhole you in a React place if, you're just sort of like passing through to understand it better or something like that. So you're mapping, as best you can, again, the needs of the business to the wants, needs, desires, et cetera, to the people that work under you. All right, those are the 3 points I wanted to touch on. People management in the context of project management. Questions, comments? All right. So, timelines. Everybody wants to know, when's it going to be done, right? Like sometimes you'll have things that are 6 months out, that need to be delivered in 6 months or 6 weeks or 6 days or whatever it is. And other parts of the organization, whether it's, somebody in customer success that's interfacing directly with the customer, or the CEO hitting revenue numbers, or something to pitch to the investment community, whatever it is. Everybody want to know when it's going to be done. And, it's hard. It's hard for a whole lot of different reasons. And the, simplest way to put it is that, if it was easy, like we wouldn't be having the conversation. It would be, and people have made all these efforts to sort of come up with ways to make things more predictable. But they're all fuzzy, right? Because they're all based on estimates. And one of the things that I try to be really clear with people outside, the engineering organization and within, is estimates are estimates, not commitments. So when I ask about like how long do you think something's going to take, I never just say that question just like in isolation. When I want to have some idea when something's going to be done, I'll ask people for a number, but a percentile that goes with it. And sometimes, I'll offer up the percentile. So just anecdotally, when I was at ONI Systems with you, back in the day, this is the late 90s, early 2000s, there were 4 main software groups, and the other 3 software groups would always make really aggressive estimates. And I would, in retrospect, I sort of label those sort of like 50th percentile estimates, like, what's a 50-50 chance of getting it done in 4 days or a week or whatever it is, or even a day. Like, yeah, you might, if everything goes perfectly, yeah, what would that be? But of course, it almost never does go perfectly, right? And sometimes, your chain of command will be really excited about these aggressive estimates, because again, they can use them to sort of flog people to work really hard, because when inevitably, the thing goes wrong or it just takes longer or whatever, then you're like, well, you better stay late tonight. Oh, you better come in on a weekend or whatever. And again, it's that sort of, I consider it unethical, trying to squeeze as much value out of salaried employees as possible. And that leads to frustration and burnout. And, it's hard to feel good about your job if you're constantly blowing through estimates, I think. But my boss on the 4th team, he had a very different approach. He never, ever, 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 ever wanted to blow a deadline. And so he would do what I call 98th percentile estimating, which is what's the, I'm going to miss a deadline approximately never. And so what he would do is, I was a pretty good estimator of my own work. Like, wasn't great at estimating other people's work, but I could tell you, like, yeah, it'll probably take a day or a week or whatever. And I would put in my own little, bias in favor of wanting to hit those. I like to be on time. I like to be as accurate as I can. And I'd much rather deliver early than deliver late. And what Ravi would do is multiply my estimates by 4 or 5. He would move it up to the next biggest unit. If I said a day, he'd say a week. If I said a week, he'd say a month. If I said a month, he'd put it at, a quarter or something like that. And, of course, estimating something as a quarter size is, silly anyway. We'll talk about that in a moment. But it created this incredible difference between these other 3 teams, where people were like staying nights and weekends and whatever to get their stuff done. And, they're bringing in pizza and all that. I would get my stuff done. If I said a day, it almost always just took a day. And then, what am I doing for the rest of this, release cycle? I'm like twiddling my thumbs. And so it made me look bad in front of all my peers, because it looked like I was the one that was sandbagging. Like, oh, Maxim's just totally like, patting the living shit out of estimating in order to look good. And I'm like, it's not me. So, the way I, dealt with that is I would just go around, because I was working on like internal tools and, some customer facing stuff, but a mix of things. I would go over to sales. I'm like, hey, do you guys need some software? And they'd be like, what do you mean? I'm like, I don't know. Like, what do you do in your job every day that might be automatable? And they're like, well, we spend a lot of time in Visio generating these diagrams. I'm like, oh, I can go off and, so I would build tools for the salespeople, and I would build tools for the installer people that would like generate work orders and stuff like that. And then the problem with that is like, I've solved the first problem, Ravi patting the shit out of my schedules. And that created another problem, is the QA would get these features that like, they didn't have specs or anything like whatever. And they're like, what is this? We can't test this. We don't have a plan. We don't, whatever. And they were mad at me. I'm like, I can't even win. So, long-winded way of saying that to get people on the same page, you need to agree about like, how aggressive are we being? And I like to say not 85th percentile is a pretty good number. So the thing about estimating is that like, it can blow up infinitely on the delay side, but you can only bring it in. If you say it's going to take 5 days, in the best possible case, it takes 5 minutes and you've gained yourself 5 days. But if it takes 5 days and you go over by a factor of 3, you've blown 10. So what's a number that lets you sort of on average, when something goes long, make up for the fact that, like basically most of the time you're going to have a little bit of surplus, and you're going to add up little surplus, and occasionally you're going to blow it on something, that's bigger. So when I talk about like, that, estimating something in terms of days or whatever, I like to specify 85th percentile, but you got to get the other managers to agree with that, right? Again, you can't have like Ravi's versus everybody else without having that made explicit. but there's a lot of ways to do it. You know, you can do, you know, the number of days thing, and that's a very linear approach, right? But there's also like, you know, sort of, you know, t-shirt sizing and whatever. And I don't remember what the name of it is, but like, what's the thing we're doing with the story points? Yeah, story points. The story points are very, I think those count as exponential because they're using Fibonacci numbers, right? Like it's 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, right? Like 21. And
Geometric.
Is that geometric? Okay.
Geometric.
You know, and then, you know, there's like t-shirt sizing, small, medium, large, whatever, right? And I think the key to all these things is just don't go too far off the scale, right? I think they all in some ways kind of reduce to linear, like as long as you keep them small. Like whenever I've done projects where we were using, you know, number of days to do a thing, I would never let anybody give me a number bigger than 5. I'm like, if you tell me it's 15, break it up for me, right? Like if I go 15 days, I won't know on the 5th day or the 10th day how far ahead or behind we might be nearly as well if there's not these intermediate milestones where I can say yes, done, no, not done, or whatever, right? Like if you get up to the 15th day and it's time to ship it or, you know, whatever, and then the rest of the product is ready to integrate or what have you, like, oh, I'm about half done. Well, you know, the visibility, the granularity is too big to be useful. You know, and then there's the sort of the agile versus waterfall cramming in. Okay. Yeah, I guess that's what I wanted to say about timelines is that you know, whatever set of tools your company is using, and I'm not going to try to like that kind of project timeline management stuff, like that could be a whole book on itself. The takeaway here is that like whatever you're using, make sure that like it's a tool that you've mastered, or at least, you know, are making an effort to master, that you understand what the pitfalls are, that you don't sort of walk into the obvious mistakes the first time, you know, you're doing it in a leadership position where you're probably not just making estimates for yourself or internalizing them, you're doing it for the team. But also like pay really close attention when you can to everybody on the team, because they're usually going to have some sort of factor. You know, there's going to be people that want to impress you with how, oh, I can do that in a day, right? And maybe they can, and maybe they can't. And then some people are just really cautious, you know, like my old boss, Robbie, and say like, oh, well, you know, I'm going to, the Star Trek Mr. Scott thing, like, oh, I couldn't possibly do it in less than, you know, a week or whatever. And then they go do it in an hour and then they, you know, kick back. So just being aware, sometimes it's really hard to be self-aware about this stuff, but this is where you as a leader can help, you know, teach your people to estimate somewhat better. And it's not that important, right? Like if you've got somebody that's a chronic overestimator or underestimator, you just go in and fiddle with it, you know, maybe even when they're not looking, right? And say, you know, I just noticed about you based on this evidence, you know, keep notes, you know, when people tend to blow over things, just like, yeah, you know, last time you said it was an 8, it turned out to be a 13. So is it okay if I just, you know, call this a 13 instead of an 8 this time? And it'll be awesome. You know, we can squeeze a couple things in late if, you know, you happen to bring this in early. You know, like if you're gentle about it, you're kind about it, you know, you can achieve the goals of increasing sort of the accuracy and the visibility sort of up the chain of command. You know, and also when things move, like be really aggressive about propagating it to anybody that cares, right? Like coming back to one of the key principles that I don't think I've hit on much yet, but like your job in leadership is to try to minimize surprise, right? That means staying out in front of work. That means staying out in front of like HR flavored issues, personality conflicts, all that stuff. The sooner you address the problems and the sooner you create visibility for potential problems, the more opportunities you'll have to like, you know, make minor course corrections instead of huge course corrections later. And also like if people are engaging in bad behavior, the sooner you give them the feedback, the less ingrained that behavior will be, the less entitled people will be to exhibit bad behavior. Like, and this is where you can get into trouble with prima donna types, right? Who are really, you know, sometimes you'll meet someone who's like really, really, really good at their job, like amazing at their job, you know, but their interpersonal stuff leaves much to be desired. And you can be like, wow, that person is amazingly productive. Well, if they're pissing off their team, you know, or they're causing other teammates to be unproductive because they're not showing up, you know, for whatever, that can be super corrosive. And, you know, sometimes like, oh, I don't want to like, you know, hurt that person's feelings. They're one of our best engineers. Well, yeah. And think about, the blast radius of different types of poor behavior. And, committing to things that you can't reasonably do is an example of poor behavior, and excessively padding your schedules is an example of poor behavior. So, another topic, agile versus waterfall. Like, I think almost everybody is using some form of agile, but it's all over the place. Some places, like they still like waterfall because I think it gives you more productivity. And some places, like in biotech, like we really needed to do waterfall at PacBio by and large. Like, yeah, we had cycles and really we had release cycles and stuff, but like there were just so many dependencies. And it really depends on how gruesome the dependencies are. Like we had dependencies between, people in the photonics group and people in the software group and people in the chemistry group and people in the, enzyme group and all these different things. So like, you might find yourself in those situations. So, and also if you ever hear the word agile fall, oh, we're doing agile fall, run. that's a, Frankenstein's monster of epic proportions where we're like, oh, we're going to get the best of both worlds, and you're probably going to end up with the worst of both. So, also my last thought on this is like, resist the urge to cram in more stuff, right? Coming back to sort of the notion of priorities, and actually, maybe I'll take D and E and put those, integrate those higher up. But, if someone comes to you and says, well, could you also do this? Could you squeeze that into the sprint or whatever, right? I always start with, great, what do you want me to not do? Which of the things that I'm working on now, what are the things that are planned in the sprint that you want me to not do? Well, just sneak it in there that no, absolutely effing not, right? And that's something you should be willing to, stand as firm as you possibly can on, because it's just ridiculous. You can't, do more than you can do. I mean, it sounds like a tautology, but I mean, I think we've all been in that place of trying to like sneak extra stuff in there, and it always degrades something else. So, be sure that, and if somebody is pressuring you that's not your boss, take it straight to your boss. Okay. Pausing again for questions, discussions, concerns, things I missed, things I should emphasize more, things I should elaborate on more. Okie dokie, artichokes. Well, it's quarter till. I'm a little torn because like the next topic is massive, interviewing. And again, that's going to take up a whole hour by itself. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to call it, obviously I'm recording this stuff for my, eventual transcription into a book, hopefully. And, again, happy to talk about whatever, whenever. But the other thing is, class 1, y'all are class, tranche number 2, is about to wrap. I think end of day Monday is going to be it. So I will have time to go up to either 2 or 3 days. I think we'll just start with 2. I think 2 is plenty, but I kind of have like, energy and brain space to do more. But look for an invite. I have to go and like, make sure that I can find a recurring slot, which is hard with a group like this, to find, another hour-long slot. And it'll be almost certainly Monday or Wednesday, because that's where my other classes are. So. Okay, the doc's always available, the group Slack channel for the class is always available, and my DMs are always available. And I deeply appreciate any feedback, commentary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to stop recording. Happy Friday, y'all.
Thank you. Happy Friday.
Thanks.
Same time next week, if not sooner.